"You let yourself go, Juliet. I didn't marry this." These words echoed in the silence of their home, sharp and cruel, spoken by a man who had once vowed to love, cherish, and protect his wife. But love, his love, was conditional. It was fragile enough to break when his wife's body no longer met his expectations. When Juliet, like so many women after childbirth, found her body changing, her husband's affection twisted into something entirely different. He looked at her and saw not the woman he had once cherished, but something he could no longer bear. The once tender touch, the warm embrace, now replaced with scorn, contempt, and disgust. For months, their relationship deteriorated. The weight of their child, the sleepless nights, the physical changes, it all seemed to push him farther away. But he didn't just grow distant. He became something unrecognizable. He couldn't see her as the woman he once loved. All he could see was a shell, a woman he no longer desired. And that hatred festered. That night, Juliet dialed 911. The phone line crackled as she remained silent, her breath quick and shallow. She didn't speak a word. But when the officers arrived, they didn't need her to speak. The scene in the house told its own story. A gruesome tale that would haunt everyone who heard it. And as investigators looked on in shock, they realized they were dealing with something far worse than they had ever imagined. The man who had taken an oath to protect others had taken the life of the one person he had once promised to protect the most. What had driven him to commit such an unimaginable act of violence? What had been brewing beneath the surface of their marriage? And how had a devoted state trooper become a killer in the most horrific way possible? Before we go deeper, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories from the deepest part of the human core. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Juliet Johnson, a woman who had dreams of a happy family, who had spent her days caring for her newborn and keeping a loving home, was a victim of something many failed to see coming. A man who swore to uphold the law, a respected state trooper, someone trusted to protect and serve, became the very monster he was meant to stop. He had seen violence in the line of duty. He had witnessed crime and pain, but none of that prepared him for what he would do to his own wife, his own flesh and blood. The brutality of the crime left the authorities stunned, and they were left asking, how could this have happened? What turned a man who had been sworn to protect his community into a murderer? The bloodshed that took place in that house was as cold as the heart of the man responsible. It wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a calculated, horrific act of cruelty. Juliet's head was severed from her body, a sight that would stay with the officers who arrived on the scene forever. But what led to this? What could have driven him to such an unimaginable crime? Was it something that had been simmering in their marriage for years, or was this a moment of irreversible madness? Was he just a man broken by the expectations of fatherhood, or was there something deeper at play? Tonight, we begin our investigation into the life of Juliet Johnson and the disturbing events that led to her tragic death. We'll take a look at the love they once shared, the marriage that became tainted, and the horrifying actions of a man who was supposed to be her protector. What pushed him to commit such an unthinkable act? And why did he believe he could do so without consequence? Prepare yourself for a deep, unsettling look at the darkest corners of the human mind, and a crime that continues to shock even those who have seen the worst of humanity. This story will make you question the very nature of love and the fragility of what can happen when it turns into something much more dangerous. Juliet Johnson wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had big dreams, a fierce determination, and a kind heart that attracted everyone she met. Born and raised in a small town, she had always been surrounded by the simplicity and warmth of rural life. She was a woman with ambition and compassion, balancing both with ease. Growing up, Juliet's parents instilled in her a strong sense of values, hard work, kindness, and a belief that life could be beautiful, no matter the circumstances. Juliet had always been the kind of person who sought to make those around her happy. She was the kind of mother who took pride in her family, the kind of woman who always made sure her home was warm, welcoming, and filled with love. But it was her love story, that seemed to capture everyone's attention. It started when she met him, the man who would become her husband. He was a state trooper, a man who wore a badge with pride and who had built a reputation for being dedicated to his work. He was a strong, stoic figure, someone respected by his peers and admired by many in their small town. Juliet was captivated by him from the moment they met. To her, he represented the epitome of strength and honor. His presence made her feel safe, as though the world could never harm her as long as he was by her side. And in those early days, he did everything to make her feel loved, to show her how much he adored her. Their relationship seemed like something out of a fairy tale. They were the couple everyone envied, the perfect pair, so in sync with one another that nothing could shake their bond. Together, they shared dreams of a family, a home, and a future where they would grow old together. They had big plans for the future, for their children, for a life filled with laughter and warmth. Juliet believed in their love with every ounce of her being, believing that nothing could ever come between them. But the story of Juliet and her husband wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Because while their marriage appeared flawless to the outside world, behind the smiles and the happy moments, something was starting to shift. Juliet never saw it coming, but the man she married was slowly becoming a stranger to her. Her husband, the state trooper, was known for his dedication to his work. Every day, he put on his uniform with pride, setting out into the world to serve and protect, to uphold justice and order. His reputation as a hard-working, reliable officer earned him the respect of his colleagues, and those who knew him personally admired his commitment to both his job and his family. To everyone who knew him, he was a man of honor, someone who could be trusted to do the right thing. But behind his professional persona, something was changing. At home, the loving husband who once made Juliet feel like the most important woman in the world began to withdraw. At first, it was subtle, small things, almost unnoticeable. He was tired more often, distant in conversation, and less engaged with their growing family. As their child entered the picture, Juliet's attention naturally shifted, but she never expected her husband to pull away. As the months passed, the gap between them widened. Juliet had always been a woman who took pride in her family and her role as a mother, but her husband seemed to be changing in ways she couldn't understand. He would get frustrated with her when she didn't look the way she did when they first met. His compliments grew few and far between, replaced with passive-aggressive comments about her appearance, about her weight, about how she didn't take care of herself the way she used to. The man who had once adored her now looked at her with something else in his eyes. Something hard, something unrecognizing. Juliet tried to shrug it off, thinking it was just the pressures of parenthood, the stress of life catching up to them. But she couldn't deny it. Her husband's attention seemed to be fading, his love eroding before her eyes. She could feel the change, but she couldn't grasp why it was happening. They had always been so close, so in sync with one another. How could they have drifted apart so quickly? And then there were the outbursts, the arguments, the tension that filled their once peaceful home. The things he said to her, cruel things. "You let yourself go, Juliet. I didn't marry this." These were the words she would hear, thrown at her like daggers. They weren't just words, they were a declaration. A declaration of something broken, something irreparable. And though she tried to hold on to the hope that it was just a rough patch, deep down, Juliet feared the truth. Her husband's love was fading. She had always believed in the vows they made on their wedding day. She had always believed that love was enough to overcome anything. But her husband was no longer the man she had married. The affection, the tenderness, those things were slowly replaced by frustration and resentment. His coldness grew, and Juliet's attempts to keep the peace only seemed to make matters worse. But there was something more. Something Juliet couldn't have predicted. In the months leading up to the tragedy, something began to shift in her husband. Something darker, something that terrified her. His behavior became even more erratic, more unpredictable. The anger was no longer just in his words. His actions, too, began to change. It was the silence that spoke the loudest, the coldness that seemed to swallow every room they entered. Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And she was right. But the secret her husband had been hiding was far more shocking than she could have imagined, and it would soon come to light in the most horrific way possible. After the birth of their child, Juliet's world changed in ways she hadn't anticipated, as most new mothers experience. The sleepless nights, the endless feedings, the overwhelming sense of responsibility, it was all consuming. But amid all the chaos, she was also filled with a sense of joy. She had a new life to care for, a beautiful child to cherish. It was supposed to be the start of something wonderful, a new chapter in their lives. But instead, it marked the beginning of her downfall. Juliet's body, like every mother's body, began to change. Her belly, once round with pregnancy, now flattened and softened. Her once toned figure, the one her husband had adored so much, slowly shifted into the body of a new mother, still beautiful, still strong, but different. Her clothes no longer fit the way they once had, and the weight of motherhood began to take its toll on her. To Juliet, it was all worth it. The changes in her body were a small price to pay for the life they had created together. She didn't mind the weight gain. She didn't mind the way her body had shifted. Her love for her baby and her family was more important than any superficial standards of beauty. But her husband, the man who once showered her with affection, now seemed to see her as something less than what she had been before. He started to make comments, subtle at first, about how she wasn't the same. The way her clothes hung on her differently, how she no longer had the figure that first caught his eye. Juliet brushed it off at first, telling herself that it was just the stress of becoming a parent. But the remarks became more frequent, more cutting. "Why don't you take care of yourself anymore?" he would ask with a tone of frustration. "You're getting a little heavy," he'd mutter under his breath, as if she wasn't even there. Her husband's affection for her began to fade, and in its place, a critical eye seemed to settle in. The man she once believed loved her unconditionally, through thick and thin, was now questioning her every decision, every move. Juliet found herself wondering what had happened to the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had always said he loved her for who she was, regardless of anything else. But this wasn't just about appearance anymore. The cracks in their relationship were deepening in ways that Juliet couldn't ignore. The love they once shared, the easy companionship they'd enjoyed, was now replaced by silent treatment, cold glances, and increasingly frustrated conversations. It was as if, little by little, her husband was slipping away, leaving her alone to raise their child with no one by her side to help. The tension grew over time, steadily intensifying until it could no longer be ignored. What started as passive-aggressive comments and sarcastic remarks about her appearance soon escalated into something far darker. The physical distance between them grew into an emotional chasm that Juliet could not cross, no matter how hard she tried. Her husband's once kind words became sharp and bitter. He criticized her for gaining weight, for not bouncing back to her pre-pregnancy figure. He made comments about how he could no longer find her attractive, how she wasn't good enough anymore. It wasn't just that he seemed uninterested, he now seemed disgusted by her. "I didn't marry this," he would say, his voice dripping with contempt. It was a phrase that stung every time, like a dagger to her heart. It wasn't just her appearance he was attacking anymore. It was who she was, everything she had become after becoming a mother. The woman he had once promised to cherish now felt like nothing more than a burden, someone who had failed him. At first, Juliet tried to explain, to reason with him. She was doing everything she could. She had a newborn to care for, and she was trying to adjust to the massive changes in her life. But nothing seemed to appease him. His anger, which had started with cold words, was now becoming more visible in his actions. The resentment in his eyes was palpable. He would raise his voice over the smallest of things. His temper seemed to flare up out of nowhere, as if every little mistake she made was a personal affront to him. The loving, protective man she had married had now become someone she feared. It wasn't just about her weight anymore. It was about control, about power. The relationship that once felt like a partnership had now become an abusive dynamic. Juliet tried to hold on to the love they once had, but the reality of their marriage had changed beyond recognition. Things soon escalated beyond verbal abuse. It wasn't just words anymore. It was something much worse, something more terrifying. Juliet began to feel it in her bones. The atmosphere in their home had shifted. There were moments where she could feel his eyes on her, cold and calculating, as if she were a stranger, a person he barely recognized. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable. There were days when she could hear his footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate, as though he were following her around the house. His presence, once comforting, now felt like a looming threat. The way he would look at her, with such disdain, made her skin crawl. She wanted to confront him, to ask him what was really going on, but she couldn't. Not anymore. There was something darker in him now, something she couldn't explain, but that she could feel. And then it happened. One night, when everything seemed to be at its breaking point, Juliet had a sense of dread that she couldn't ignore. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. Something in the air told her that things would never be the same. The man she married, the man who had once vowed to protect her, was now the greatest danger she had ever faced. And as the days passed, Juliet realized with a sickening certainty that she had no idea what he was capable of. It was an ordinary night, at least on the surface. Juliet went about her usual routine, exhausted after a long day of caring for their child. She had become used to the weight of the silence that filled their home. Her husband had grown increasingly distant, and though she had long feared the violence that lurked beneath his temper, tonight would be different. Tonight, things would escalate in a way she couldn't have anticipated. Juliet knew something was wrong. The unease in her stomach had grown stronger over the past few days. And tonight, the air felt thick, oppressive. She knew her husband was on edge. There was a coldness to him, something unspoken but palpable. Every glance, every moment of silence felt like a ticking time bomb, just waiting to go off. As the evening wore on, the tension reached a breaking point. Her husband's anger, once hidden behind biting words, was now bubbling to the surface in unpredictable bursts. The frustration in his eyes was unbearable, and Juliet, though terrified, couldn't avoid it any longer. She had to confront him. But before she could even say a word, her husband snapped. In a moment of pure rage, he lashed out at her, his anger manifesting in violent, brutal ways. It wasn't just the words anymore. It was everything he had been holding inside, all of his resentment, frustration, and hatred towards her. Juliet fought back in the only way she knew how. She screamed, she tried to run, but it was too late. In the midst of the chaos, Juliet managed to do something that, in that moment, would be the only thing that could save her. She dialed 911. But in the frenzy of the attack, all she could do was silently breathe into the phone. No words, no cries for help. Just the sound of her breath, ragged and frantic, drifting across the line. Minutes passed, but to Juliet, they felt like hours. The operator on the other end of the line couldn't hear her, couldn't understand what was happening, but help was on the way. The call had been made. They just had to find her in time. When the authorities arrived at the house, they had no idea what they were about to walk into. What they expected to find was a domestic dispute, a call for help in the middle of the night. But what they discovered when they entered the home would forever haunt them. The scene that greeted them was one of unimaginable horror. The house, once filled with the sound of children's laughter and the warmth of family life, was now a grotesque crime scene. Juliet's body was found, dismembered in the most horrific manner. Her lifeless form was broken into pieces, arms, legs, and torso scattered throughout the house. But the most chilling detail was the absence of her head. Her husband had taken the violence to a level that no one could have foreseen. The rage he had kept hidden for so long had erupted in a brutal act of savagery. The love that had once defined their marriage, the bond they had shared, had been twisted into something beyond recognition. The officers moved methodically, their faces grim with the weight of what they were seeing. This wasn't just a murder, it was something far more shocking. It was an act so brutal, so calculated, that it defied explanation. How could someone who had once pledged to love and protect their partner for life turn into a monster capable of such violence? As the investigation continued, the details emerged. Juliet's dismembered body, the bloodstains that were scattered throughout the house, and the unsettling realization that her death had been premeditated. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the initial attack, just a methodical dissection of her body that sent shivers down the spines of every officer who saw it. The motive. What could possibly drive a man, a state trooper sworn to uphold the law, to commit such a horrifying act against his own wife? Was it rage? Was it revenge for the changes in her body after childbirth? Or was there something more to the story that had yet to be uncovered? The real shock came when her husband was apprehended and brought in for questioning. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't resist. He didn't pretend it was anything other than what it was. He confessed. But it wasn't just the fact that he confessed. It was what he revealed in his confession that sent shockwaves through the community. He described the crime. The way he had watched Juliet, who had once been the object of his adoration, become someone he no longer recognized. He talked about how her body had changed after childbirth, how she had become fat and ugly in his eyes. He admitted that he had become repulsed by her, by the way she looked, by the way she had let herself go. And in his mind, he had convinced himself that this was her fault. She was no longer the woman he had married, and in his eyes, she had become a burden, a disappointment. The rage that had been building for months, fueled by his resentment and his shattered expectations, had finally boiled over. He sawed off her head, not in a moment of self-defense, not in a moment of passion, but in an act of cold, calculated violence. To him, this was the only way to rid himself of the woman he no longer saw as his partner, the woman who had become something he could no longer bear to look at. His confession left everyone stunned. The once respected state trooper, a man who had sworn to protect, had instead become the monster he was supposed to catch. The horror he had unleashed on his wife was incomprehensible. And yet, it had all started with something so small, something so easily overlooked, the way Juliet's body had changed after childbirth. But the true question remained. What was behind this? Was it simply a matter of vanity and selfishness, or was there something deeper at play? In the days following the brutal crime, the investigation began in earnest, but authorities were still struggling to process the confession they had just heard. How could a man who had sworn to uphold the law, someone entrusted with the safety of the public, turn into a brutal murderer so cold and calculated? The very foundation of his profession, the trust he had built over years of service, now seemed like a mask for the horrors that had been lurking beneath the surface. The case was nothing short of disturbing. What had led this state trooper, a man sworn to protect the law, to commit such a monstrous act against his own wife? As investigators scoured the scene and pieced together evidence, it became clear that the brutality of the murder was matched only by the chilling nature of the confession. His words haunted them. The confession wasn't laced with remorse or guilt. Instead, it was spoken in a cold, detached manner, almost as if he were recounting an event that didn't involve his own actions. He described, in chilling detail, how he had felt entitled to punish his wife for no longer meeting his expectations. His tone remained calm, almost devoid of emotion, as he recounted how Juliet's physical changes following the birth of their child had made her less in his eyes. She had become a woman unworthy of his love. Her body, which had once been perfect to him, was now an unforgivable betrayal. The very woman he had married had transformed, and to him, this change was unforgivable. He could no longer see her as the woman he had once loved, the woman who had filled his life with joy. He talked about the resentment that had built up over time, the frustration that festered as he watched Juliet struggle with the challenges of motherhood and the physical toll it took on her body. What had once been a healthy, blossoming marriage had, in his mind, turned into a nightmare. Her failure to stay the same, to remain as the woman he had married, drove him to an unbearable rage. And this rage, he explained, had eventually turned into violence. As the confession unfolded, it was as though the pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place. He spoke about his overwhelming sense of entitlement, about how Juliet's post-pregnancy body had made him feel betrayed, not just by her appearance, but by her failure to uphold the image of the perfect wife. He had expected her to bounce back, to be the same woman who had once captivated him, but instead, he saw only change. A change that, in his twisted mind, justified the violence he had unleashed. But it wasn't just the weight gain, the changes in her body, that he resented. It was everything that had come with it. The way she seemed distant, the way she was always tired, the way she no longer had the energy to care for him the way she once did. As her body changed, so did the dynamic of their relationship. He felt neglected, abandoned, and the simmering anger inside him began to boil over. This wasn't just a case of body image issues. This was a man who had lost control. His perception of Juliet was no longer rooted in love. It had morphed into something darker, something that sought to punish her for not meeting his impossible expectations. In the moments before the crime, Juliet had been nothing more than a reflection of his anger. The woman he had once cherished had become a symbol of everything he believed had gone wrong in his life. A failure. And so, he chose to punish her for it. He took her life in a manner so brutal that even seasoned investigators were shaken to their core. He didn't just kill her, he tore her apart, physically and emotionally, and in doing so, he shattered any remaining fragments of the man he once was. As the investigation deepened, a more twisted theory began to surface. Was this simply the result of a man's insecurity and resentment? Or was there something more beneath the surface of the crime? Could the murder have been premeditated far earlier than anyone had realized? Was Juliet's transformation really the only thing driving her husband's rage? Or was there a darker motivation, one buried even deeper than the physical changes in her body? Some began to question whether there was more to the story than anyone knew. Perhaps there were underlying issues, years of bottled-up resentment, a psyche unraveling at the seams. As investigators continued to piece together the fragments of the crime, the lingering question remained. What if this wasn't just about appearance? What if this was the culmination of years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and control? As the investigation unfolded, a range of theories began to emerge. What exactly had driven a state trooper, someone who had built his life on a foundation of discipline and duty, to commit such a gruesome and unfathomable crime? The answers weren't as straightforward as anyone hoped. Investigators were tasked with examining not only the horrific act itself, but also the emotional, psychological, and even societal factors that might have led to such violence. On one hand, there were those who argued that Juliet's husband, who had once sworn to love her unconditionally, had spiraled out of control after her physical changes due to childbirth. Could this have been a tragic case of postpartum depression, or a breakdown in their relationship after the intense pressures of new parenthood? Many speculated that Juliet's husband might have been unable to cope with the changes in her, not just physically, but emotionally. A new baby, the loss of intimacy, the exhaustion of raising a child, it all took a toll on her, and her husband's inability to accept this left him simmering with resentment. The weight gain, the tiredness, and the changes in their dynamic had undoubtedly affected him, and he may have felt overwhelmed by his own sense of entitlement. Had he always seen her as a symbol of perfection, unable to see her humanity beyond her looks and her role as a wife and mother? However, others believed the act was more premeditated, driven by deep-seated issues of jealousy and entitlement. Some pointed to the fact that the crime was so brutal, so calculated, that it couldn't have been the result of a mere outburst of anger. This had been a planned act of violence. The husband had carefully thought through his actions, and the way he spoke about the murder, detached, cold, and with a hint of justification, seemed to suggest a man who had been consumed by his own warped sense of control. Some even speculated that societal pressures played a role in this tragedy. In a world that increasingly values physical perfection and idealized versions of beauty, could the expectations placed on women to return to their pre-baby bodies so quickly have contributed to this fatal breakdown? Perhaps the husband's resentment wasn't just about Juliet's physical changes, but about his own insecurities, the pressures of masculinity, and the unrealistic standards placed on his family life. He was a state trooper, a figure of authority and discipline. Yet here he was, unable to manage his personal life, his emotions, and his frustrations with a partner he once loved. Did he truly see Juliet as the perfect wife and mother? Or had he expected more than any human being could reasonably give? The deeper the investigation went, the more the case seemed to reflect a tragic intersection of personal flaws, societal pressures, and a marriage pushed to its breaking point. Now, it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think drove this shocking act of violence? Was this a case of a marriage slowly unraveling, a relationship strained by the complexities of parenthood and physical change? Or was this a deliberate act of violence, born from deep internal hatred and a need for control? How much did the expectations of perfection, both personal and societal, play into this tragedy? Did Juliet's transformation into motherhood somehow make her less in her husband's eyes, less worthy of his affection? Or was his crime rooted in something far darker, perhaps jealousy, rage, or a warped sense of entitlement? As you watch this story unfold, we want to hear from you. Was this a tragedy of a broken marriage spiraling out of control? Or was it a calculated crime born from a deep, internal hatred? What do you think actually happened that night? Don't forget to share your theories with us in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe for more unsettling true crime stories.